Welcome to Ideas of India, where we examine the academic ideas that can propel India forward. My name is Shruti Rajagopalan, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Today, my guest is Saumitra Jha, who is the associate professor of political economy at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. We talked about his research on the kinds of rules, organizations, and norms that emerge to foster long-term peace, how trade increased interreligious tolerance in South Asia, complementarity and competition between different ethnic groups, religious tensions in modern-day Gujarat, Indian exceptionalism and non-violence, and much more. For a full transcript of this conversation, including helpful links of all the references mentioned, click the link in the show notes or visit discoursemagazine.com. Hi, Saumitra. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
I wanted to look at some of your work on sort of the long arc of the relationship between commerce and peace. In particular, I want to start with your APSR paper on trade, institutions, and ethnic tolerance. And one of the things that you find, which is super interesting, is the long-run impact of whether an area had a medieval port that was a functioning medieval port with Muslim-dominated trade routes. You find that those areas are more ethnically mixed, right? But they tend to be less prone to Hindu-Muslim violence, right? And by a significant amount, 5 times less in some cases, in terms of modern-day violence. The relationship that you point out is between trade complementarity versus trade competition. That's sort of like the driving mechanism for this work. And you also find in a related paper, which is about the Gujarat riots, once again, areas that used to be medieval ports, even if they're not functional ports today, saw far less violence and also less severe violence. And in fact, they also have far greater tolerance, which you find because they punish the sort of dominant dispensation, which was the sort of instigator of violence, by giving them a lower vote share after the Gujarat riots are over. So I find this interesting because the long-term sort of peace in this area hinges almost on a historical accident. It almost feels like there's very little in control of what we could do today other than having had long-term peaceful relationships. That's one part that I want to dig into. And the other part is this idea of competitive versus complementary skills while trading between ethnic groups, because that's the condition for peace. So can you just tell us a little bit more about how this works historically and what implications this has for modern day ethnic violence? this kind of trade relationship, which may or may not exist today.
Firstly, I think that actually these things can be created. So I think that there is there are policies that, and there are groups that actually use these ideas in a variety of different ways. So if I may, I'd love to return to that. I think that it is true that there is if you look through history, there are places which just have been incredibly tolerant, and it wasn't necessarily preordained that would be the case. And they're tolerant among specific communities, not necessarily in general as well, right? So I think the issue, though, is I think what we can learn from those environments is what are the conditions under which you can have religious tolerance or ethnic tolerance, but also, what are the things that people do to reinforce that? And I think what I found, which is really interesting going to a number of these port towns was oftentimes the answers are quite different. So even though the underlying logic that people had, just kind of briefly, as we kind of mentioned I mentioned in the studies, but it's sort of fairly well understood. I mean, Muslims dominated Indian Ocean trade all the way up to China. And largely this had to do with the fact that for 1 month every year for 1,000 years, Makkah was the largest market in the world for certain products. And there are other pilgrimage routes to Cairo, Fustat, to Basra. And these used to coordinate trade. And you had to largely be a Muslim. You had to be a Muslim to go to Mecca. So that made it a big advantage for Muslims and they ended up dominating trade. One fun part of this study was that I got to read all these medieval travelers' narratives. And one person who's, really stuck with me, this is a Italian called Ludovico de Vertema. And Ludovico, he's from Rome. And I guess he got the travel bug and he decided to to try and go to Mecca. So he pretended he was Muslim and he went to Mecca, but then he got exposed as a Christian, and then he got sold into slavery. And so he ended up, working on a boat owned by a Persian ship owner, and he basically traveled around the coast of the Middle East and then to India, and that's why he left a kind of a good understanding of what was going on in the ports of these medieval ports, because they just kind of went down the coast and talked about what he saw there. Eventually he escapes and he returns to Rome and he talks about his account. But, it kind of brings home the fact that you couldn't be a non-Muslim and be in Mecca mostly. And if you were, you might end up like Ludovico. But I think one thing that he noted and other contemporaries noted was that there was this remarkable amount of tolerance, and even Sheikh Zain al-Din Malabari, who's he wrote a book called Tufat ul-Mujahideen, The Gift to the Holy Warrior. So this is not a book about peace. But he notes how in parts of Malabar, in Kerala, even though they weren't under Muslim rule, Muslims were treated very well. And in fact, even though they were only 10% of the population, there was a lot of tolerance because people knew that they brought wealth through trade. And so, you see this in Gujarat on the coast in Somnath. There's, there's still a kind of an inscription saying why they reinvited Muslim traders like Niruddin Firuz of Hormuz to settle in a place where there'd been, massive ethnic violence with the sacking of Solmath. The temporal authorities are asking Muslims to settle in these territories. You see it on the eastern coast, like the Coromandel coast as well. And you see it in Indonesia. And you see it in Africa, in East Africa also. So, I think that, what was interesting to me is not only that there was, this trade, but it was also conditional on a few things, right? So, oftentimes if you look at Latin America, for example, trade has been associated with coercion. It's been associated with slaves. It's been associated with, forced labor. And so in other work, we've been looking at indigenous communities in Mexico and how they survived the conquest of Mexico. In India and in the Indian Ocean region, and more generally, I think with middlemen minorities, I think one key difference was they were providing a valuable service that was hard to replicate. A Hindu couldn't, replicate the scale of the Hajj or steal it as a trading network. But also, you could become rich and if you're a vulnerable minority, you could still be, people could do bad things to you to steal your stuff. But it becomes harder if you're a trader, and because fine, these guys are being mean to me, I'll go somewhere else. And so there's almost like there's competition between ports to attract trades, and this led to sort of a very strong incentive to be peaceful.
There's also, if I understand correctly, competition within Muslim groups, right? The barriers to entry are relatively low. In fact, it's very easy to convert to Islam, relatively speaking. So people can at any point join the Muslim community and become one of these traders, which keeps a competitive pressure on the fact that these traders actually have to perform a valuable service and not just extort, out of the local Hindu communities whose goods they are hoping to ship up across the world, right? So there's also a second competitive element within the ethnic group. Or did I misunderstand that?
No, that's exactly right. And it wasn't just Muslims. It was like, the Armenian Christians are heavily involved. Jewish, traders were also involved. And so, but they were all seen as kind of, competing against each other, but also, it created tolerance for all of these groups until the Portuguese came and tried to do things a bit differently. Their view is, we don't want these guys to be trading. We want to do the trading and we want to control that trade. So they tried to monopolize it. But even then, it took, several centuries before it kind of completely disappeared. I mean, we know that it wasn't difficult for people to, precisely because the Hajj was this big coordinating device. You didn't have to be from a trading community to do it. So unlike, South Asia, people from South Asia often have these business castes, and that makes it easier to, get into business than if you're not in a business caste, or the Hokkien Chinese in Indonesia, where, you're part of a group and it's hard to enter. In this case, you could be like Ibn Battuta, he's a lawyer, and just, decide you want to travel the world, and, you bring some stuff with you, and you go to Mecca, you trade your way around the world. So so it was pretty easy for any Muslim in principle to basically become a trader in this time. I think what was also interesting is if you see the descriptions of tolerance, if you're kind of a Hindu who converted to Islam, sometimes if you're from a lower caste, even, you'd actually be treated better once you're, the same person, there's accounts saying that they actually were treated better once they converted to Islam by Hindus, because now they're part of this trading network that is complementary, whereas before they were seen as sort of from a lower caste and, all the baggage that comes with oftentimes in Indian history.
So it seems like the incentives that need to be aligned are, one, of course, there need to be gains from trade so that, the ethnic majority in this instance doesn't have an incentive to just shut the other group down or, sort of wipe the other group out or run them out of town. So one is the gains from trade aspect, right?
Mm-hmm.
That the size of the pie needs to grow and they hopefully get a larger share of the pie. But the second part, which is quite interesting, is that they shouldn't be able to appropriate the skills that are offered by the minority group or the Muslims. And in this case, there is a travel restriction for Hindus to cross the 7 seas, right? Which doesn't exist for the Muslims. So it seems like there's one group that can't quite trade across, the sea trading routes. And there's this other group that has this natural advantage in it. And therefore the entire thing works. But if both of them were competing for the same trading routes, the entire thing might have collapsed and medieval ports would have never taken off as tolerant areas. Is that a good way to think about it?
Well, you're referring to Kala Pani, which is, I think is really fascinating because it actually emerges later on. So it's, we know that, for example, in South India, people were trading all the way to Indonesia. That's why Hinduism spreads to Indonesia, and it became, large parts of it, Bali is still Hindu. So there was a lot of trade going on in South India, historically. There's the, Cholas who were kind of had spread variety of different places. But Kala Pani, this idea that if you are a Hindu and you go across the Black Water, you will lose your caste. That actually is a recent phenomenon. It comes out, recent by in 17th, 18th centuries. So it's actually after, when the Europeans increasingly begin to challenge the Muslim sort of dominance in trade or the Middle Eastern dominance. That's when you start seeing this response by Hindus. And it seems like it's in these port towns. And it starts off earlier, I think, in Kerala, in Malabar, and then it actually spreads to Gujarat later. And so I think one thing to think about there is that's when this is almost like a response to maintain the complementarity in a moment, time when, it's not like something that was necessary, but it's sort of a reinforcing way to keep this system working in an environment where it's being challenged by the kind of the external shock of the European attempt to dominate trade. And similarly, like when Hindus are, moving to elsewhere in the colonial British Empire and so on and so forth, these things are still there in these port towns, right? So, I mean, you think about, in Mahatma Gandhi, when he goes to London to go to law, to go to the bar, he comes, the law courts, not the bar.
Yeah.
But when he comes back to India, he has to basically do purification ritual.
Purification ritual. All of them did. All the upper caste men had to do that at that time.
Yeah, and when he goes to South Africa, he's actually going there as a agent for a Porbandari Muslim merchant who's, so there's all these connections continue to be there, into the modern period, which, and Mahatma Gandhi himself kind of talks about how his mother was from the Pranami sect, also from a medieval port, Jamnagar. And, there used to be a Quran in the temple where in her temple, and used to talk about, the differences and similarities. And it was a syncretic thing, which was again, kind of an organization which reinforced some of these gains from trade and presume, arguably made them more tolerant places. And he kind of says that this is one reason he thinks about his views on Hindu-Muslim relations are quite different than, many others, I would say.
I want to bring you back to modern day India because your paper actually traverses this entire journey, right? You started medieval ports. It's actually incredibly detailed. And now you're talking about certain parts, what happened in Gujarat during the 2002 riots post the Godhra incident. And you're comparing towns. So basically you're looking at a few different, you're slicing it a few different ways. One is medieval ports versus, towns that were not ports. And then those that could have been ports, that is, they had this natural harbor, but didn't end up as ports for a trading route, and those that did. So that we know that it's not the geographical location, but the fact that it was a trading center, which is fundamentally driving your result. And, places like Surat, places like Porbandar, you find that there is just they look quite different. So it's a bad sort of analysis to characterize all of Gujarat in one stroke. And two, once you really start digging into the differences between these towns and also what Hindus and Muslims are doing in modern day. Now, to go back to the long, shadow that's cast by history, even the places where none of this medieval trade that you've been talking about so far has taken place for centuries, you still find greater tolerance. So the second part of the story is one of, you may have found a social norm that was used to build trust because of an economic or commercial reason a long time ago, but then there were incentives to keep that social norm alive, and that norm has persisted for the next, say, 200-300 years. Can you walk us through what those incentives are and when that may happen and when we can't expect that to happen?
One interesting sort of theoretical point is about complementarities. This kind of goes back to the work of Paul Milgram and John Roberts, and I guess they Nobel Prize winning folks here at Stanford. Is that once you have this kind of initial complementarity, that can create incentives for further reinforcement of that initial complementarity, and this can create momentum even when the initial kind of relationship ceases to exist. And this underlies a lot of our monotone comparative static conclusions, is that it's some form of single crossing property or complementarity. So there's a very robust theoretical intuition for why you could have this momentum. And it doesn't have to be the same type of investment in different places, right? These norms, it could also be organizations that reinforce these norms. Avner Greif was one of my advisors. So, the way he thinks about institutions is, as a system of elements, including norms, beliefs, and organizations, which kind of work together to induce sort of a regularity of behavior. And what I like about that definition is that some of the things might, get stopped, but the others might continue and then reform in new different ways. And so that's, I think that's the kind of the part of his idea on institutions, I think, is particularly relevant to what we see in these port towns. So, for example, in South India, again, the Marakayar community, these are, again, traders in Tamil Nadu. The former president, Abdul Kalam, was from that community. They didn't, necessarily hang out with, with Hindus. It wasn't really kind of going to parties together, as I understand it, but they did a lot of business together. And these business relationships often continued for long periods of time. In many cases, they endowed Hindu temples, which is, in these areas. So kind of a way of sharing some of the gains from trade. But, in Surat, there's the old saying that, you go to Benares to die and you go to Surat to party. It's a very, there's an environment there where, people had joint celebrations, and it's a bit more integrated, particularly for the Bohra community, which was, traditionally a trading community. And it's reinforced by the organizational system, like the Bohra Jamia, their religious headquarters is still, part of it is in Surat, and every Bohra male child is in principle meant to get their name from the religious leader's administration, the Dayal Mutlaq. And they also get recommendations on what jobs to take. So there's a book by Jonah Blank called Mullahs on the Mainframe, which it describes the Bohra community and how they ask for advice on which jobs to take. And oftentimes they're told to get into niches which are complementary even today, even though it's not like, trading to the Middle East. It's sort of, oftentimes it's like hardware or certain things. And so So if you look at the data, like the Indian Human Development Survey from the early 21st century, you still find that in these medieval port towns, Muslims tend to be more focused on trade than in other towns where they tend to be more artisans and so on and so forth. And so some of these things continue and they're kind of reinforced by these religious organizational structures. So it's not like these guys are secular and they're kind of losing their religious identity. In fact, it's the religious organizations which actually help maintain some of the complementarity. And you see this in Africa as well. So there's another Ismaili group, the descendants, sort of the followers of the Aga Khan. Traditionally it's a very organized group, as but they have this thing called the Industrial Promotion Services where they actually match Ismailis and non-Ismailis into complementary relationships. So this is sort of actively doing some of what we kind of see in history as having been done. And the other thing they do, which I think is interesting, and I think really important, is that oftentimes, as I began to kind of look at these different cases around the world, if you're a vulnerable minority who's who's involved in trade, what are your incentives when it comes to potential threats? Well, you want to transfer, you might want to share some of the gains of trade, but oftentimes what ends up happening is you end up sharing some of the gains of trade with the people who are the biggest threats. So like the local mob person, the local political figure. And so you get this almost ethnic cronyism situation emerging, for example, in Indonesia, the Chinese ethnic trading minority was seen as being very highly connected with the Suharto regime. There's this paper by Ray Fisman where he shows that when Suharto gets a cold, their stock price begins to fluctuate if they're very connected and so on and so forth. And so this kind of can lead to perverse incentives even to allow ethnic violence in these environments because supposing you're a political leader, like a dictator of some kind, and you want to extract more resources from this minority group and you don't know how much money they have. Sometimes you might want to allow ethnic violence against them to demonstrate the need for protection. So it creates this perverse incentive to have pogroms on the equilibrium path, which is kind of sad, but I think we see it happen. You see it in medieval Europe. You see it in modern societies as well. But the Ismailis, I think one thing they try to do is they try to have a different equilibrium. And so so one thing they try to be much, they try to kind of not get involved in this type of, what would be many people might perceive as corrupt type of activity. And instead they engage in sort of local philanthropy in such a way that sort of they're sharing some of the gains from trade, but they're doing it with the local population rather than with the local political figures. And so that, I think, at least, the perception I have had in, looking at both the historical record as well as sort of contemporary perceptions in East Africa, for example, Ismailis, even though many of them are of a South Asian background, they're seen as quite different than other South Asians in some of these communities, precisely because have this sort of collective identity, which is kind of associated with philanthropic endeavors more, I think, than other business communities might tend to be.
Yeah. So, this brings me to an interesting point today. I mean, in the modern world, the first major change is a lot of these cities are a lot bigger and they are no longer just specializing in 2 or 3 different goods plus a port that will carry those goods and so on. Right now, these are really large cities with many, many different kinds of jobs, deep division of labor and specialization, so on. In this kind of a modern world, right, how does one think about complementarity between ethnic groups? Because they still live in a ghettoized way that is almost medieval, right? The neighborhoods still feel medieval. The marriage practices are still medieval. The incentives of the political dispensation, especially when they're very close in competition, are still medieval in terms of wanting to instigate violence. But a lot of these people may not be engaging in those medieval, occupations or trade routes anymore. So how do we think about complementarity in that regard?
There are sort of certain skilled activities that, India kind of specializes in as a country, very skilled artisanal work, which still has this flavor, right? So, you look at communities in Benares, for example, the weaving communities are still kind of very highly specialized Muslims involved in this really skilled weaving work as well. So that kind of thing is still there. And it still seems to have this kind of effect on reducing conflict relative to what it might otherwise be, because people have incentives to work together. But, environments where you have Hindu weavers and Muslim weavers doing the same thing, and this is what Ahmedabad used to be like. Even in the medieval period, you see the poles were kind of segregated right next to each other, but guarded and fortified. And you still see that these medieval cores tend to have these tensions, which erupt, particularly around electoral, when there's more political competition in those areas. In Porbandar, in Surat, and people still live in the medieval core as well, but they. Porbandar is not a kind of a fortified place. It's you see the temples and the mosques. They're not built like fortresses or big. And I think that's again a legacy of
the syncretic culture.
Of this trust. Of this trust that communities had with one another. It's reflected in the architecture as well. Surat, I think it was interesting. Surat's complicated, but the central area, it had much less violence than, and violence did happen in Surat during the 2000, during those riots, but mostly it was in the newer areas, like the newer suburbs, and where people don't have the same types of relationships as they might have done historically in these other places. So I think that there is, again, people are specializing in different new niches. It's not trading to the Middle East, but there is this sort of, there is this group momentum.
Your occupation is a birth accident, essentially, right? To a very large extent. So now the question is the birth accident leading you to a highly skilled form of labor that can't be easily expropriated and that's not in competition with the local populations? Or is it the kind of low-skilled labor which can be easily substituted and, these groups can be driven out? Is that about right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think, so you think about, I think another interesting question is how modernization might, sometimes by homogenizing human capital, we actually might
make things worse.
Groups which used to be complementary into competitors. And this can sometimes lead to more tension. There's works by folks like Sasha Becker and others looking at the removal of usury bans in Europe and how this led to more anti-Semitic activity there. Because, they used to be complementary and now they're not.
Now they could potentially compete and the Jews have an advantage in the area that they wish to enter, essentially striking or increasing the anti-Semitism, right? That's the driving force.
Yeah, that's right. And so I think that, there are ways, like the industrial promotion services of the kind of the Ismaili community where you're kind of leveraging existing complementarities in new ways. And that's one way to think about it. The other one is that, there are, you can also leverage these niches and create complementarities. And this is actually one thing that one of my former students did. He was Vivek Garg. He was an Indian Army captain. And so I kind of write about this in this piece I wrote for the European Commission on how trading for peace. So, it's basically describing some of the things he did, which is he found sort of some of the challenge. He'd served in the army in Kashmir in the northeast, and he found he didn't think that what was happening was really building local support for and peace in a kind of a sustainable way, and so he resigned his commission and he used his savings to set up this organization Bapar, which. And they tried to do things like microcredit, but, that was working pretty well. But then it started getting taxed by the insurgents. And so, now, as the Indian government doesn't allow these types of activities in certain zones. But then he did something quite clever, which was use some of these existing skills to induce complementarity. And he did this in Manipur, where he used the fact that there aren't that many there's like one big highway connecting Imphal to the north. And it used to get blockaded fairly regularly by members of the kind of Naga Christian community who were seeking a different country. And so they have very, specialized shawls and it's very specific to their specific tribes and their culture. And similarly, the Meiteis, or mostly Muslim and Hindu in Imphal have these, similar artisanal crafts. And so he basically brought, he invited some of the women from the Naga community he made them, he said, I can give you this big order for your shawls. but I'd like you to also bring in the Métis in Imphal and specifically some of their shawls, which, it's hard for you to make, and it's hard for them to make your shawls. So he's leveraging the complementarity between them. He's created a way for them to interact and get to know each other. And so that organization is hard to seize or and so this thing seems to have made it such that they started working together. And then, during blockade season, the Naga women in this endeavor asked, the insurgents, maybe just let us keep on doing our thing. And later on in Imphal, when they got an order, they brought in the folks who were on the highway. So this began to sort of, I think, build more trust between the communities, and it's, it's a sustainable thing. So it's kind of induced complementarity. Yeah. So, but I do think that there's, but these things I do think are a bit more, I think you're right that, if we already have homogeneous human capital, then it's going to be hard to do these things. And I'm not saying that we should kind of have people, stay in their niches necessarily. So I think that one alternative way, that I've been really interested in is sort of, leveraging these complementarities, but kind of giving broader exposure through financial means. So, instead of, because, unlike having these like bespoke kind of partnerships, and it's hard to scale up those things, whereas finance is something that's, very easy to scale up. And so I've been really interested in how, exposing people to similar gains that kind of, so it's in a kind of a broader generalization of this idea that, we all have to gain from peace. And so if we give people exposure to that together through the financial markets, we can also have people from different groups potentially focus on the common good and the gains to the economy rather than the things that often divide us. And, we've been doing, this seems to have been also something that you see in history. You see it in Meiji Japan. You see it in Britain. And we also found this in field experiments, which we did in Israel and also around the Brexit referendum as well. So I think, this is sort of an idea of you can leverage the modern economy as well as the kind of the medieval economy to potentially help with building tolerance and trust and peace.
Yeah, and I think there's something even one step further that I would go, because in a modern economy, our entire effort is to reduce barriers to entry, right? And a lot of these medieval social norms and religious practices are trying to keep the barriers to entry sort of really high so that different ethnic groups don't poach on each other's skills and don't appropriate each other's sort of trading routes or shops or anything else. So now you almost have a bigger problem in that the sorts of mechanisms that were used for peace, you need to bring them down to have a modern economy and, sort of virtually no barriers to entry and more competition. But in the very short run or the immediate run, more competition can actually lead to more violence. So it needs to be bolstered in some other way such that you can have long run sort of competition, contestation, low barriers to entry without trading it off for this kind of, ethnic conflict or it devolving into ethnic conflict. Because then neither do you get the benefits from competition because of lowered barriers to entry, nor do you get the peace, right? So it's this kind of weird spot to be in. I mean, it seems like a path towards modernization, but it's almost more than that. It's trying to get into sort of global social cooperation, or seems to be the biggest problem in getting developing countries, which have lots of different warring ethnic groups, to global social cooperation.
I mean, one interesting thing about the relationship between ethnic groups and sort of economic activities, and, as we kind of talked about, this is not just an Indian phenomenon. Oftentimes ethnic groups are, we end up doing things because there are certain advantages different groups have in different activities. Those things are still around, even though we don't often think about them, in the modern economy as being around. And so I think that, I think you're right that, in this world that we are in, these things are relevant and they can be leveraged both to support tolerance. But maybe what's important as well is sort of moving towards a kind of an environment where these things will stop being as relevant potentially as people become, we want everyone to do what they're best at, no matter how they're in, what the endowments are. And in those environments, this is why, again, I think the financial markets are kind of interesting because, coming from an Indian background, I was really interested in the Meiji Japanese because they had a stronger caste system than India does. It was actually enforced by the state that and they had like an untouchable group. They had a merchant group. They had a samurai caste, which had a monopoly over violence. But we don't think about Japan as being as a caste-ridden society anymore. And partly I think it's because they, while they were kind of removing some of these old, distinctions between, legal distinctions, they gave the samurai an opportunity to gain from the broader economy. And they did it by, so this is some work with Chris Mischer and Masanori Takashima. They did this by taking their rice stipends and giving them bonds and allowing them to become, capitalized banks. So they created these cross-caste institutions, these banks. It was kind of a temporary monopoly right, that you could, as a samurai, you had access to these bonds and you could create these banks. But then, over time, it's undermining the differences between samurai and non-samurai, and while creating this kind of cross-ethnic financial institution, which many of them still exist, right? So in various forms, mostly got bought out by others, but you get this. But now we don't think of the samurai as a separate group in Japan, and largely because they did these they integrated them into the financial system and reduced the conflict incentives there, while also reducing the social distinctions. I you see it in Britain as well. So I'm very interested in this for exactly the reasons that you mentioned. So, when Napoleon talks about the British as a nation of shopkeepers, he has kind of a point, because unlike in France, where there are these strong distinctions between the kind of the nobility and, the different estates, even up until the end of the 18th century. And it kind of persists a bit longer than that. In England, there's the country folks, but many of them, come from different backgrounds. If you're a merchant, you could buy shares. If you're a country person, you could buy shares in the stock market. And, you might not be considered a gentleman, but your kids can be if they just buy a manor. And so, so it's, there's this mobility there where people are actually heavily involved in investment. And it's not they're not stuck with their initial endowments in the country and raising sheep or something like that, to quite the extent that they were in other parts of Europe. And again, I think the social distinctions are diminished when you have these organizations like corporations where people can all invest in together. So I've been kind of interested in this how these organizations can diminish some of these ethnic distinctions as well, and create these, basically create sort of people who have a common interest, rather than people who kind of focus on the division, which is often around us as well.
To bring us back to say what's happening with the economic sort of fortunes of modern day Muslims in India, but in recent times, we've heard about, Muslim shops getting vandalized or demolished, oftentimes by the municipal government. More recently, we heard about how Muslims have been banned from selling anything outside the temples, which was usually a place where, all different groups were selling things that would typically be offered to the Lord, right? So that was a sort of temple economy in play, and now Muslims will be excluded from this, gaining from this temple economy. What is a good way to think about this? Is this happening because the Muslims were in competition or are in competition with things where Hindu groups could potentially also offer their goods and services? Or is this a very long run way of eliminating the Muslim advantage and complementarity by striking now and destroying the physical capital with which that, human capital and complementarity are associated? Like, how clever is the dispensation? I guess that's what I'm asking. How clever are the Hindu mobilizers, especially the mobilizers of violence in some of these more radical Hindu groups?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, there's an old playbook, that where you kind of use these types of mobilization activities to kind of get your own, base out to vote and things like that. And, it's less important about what you're doing to the other side, as long as there's another side to do it to. And so, but there's also, I think, incentives to do this more in some places than other places. And so I think, again, looking at Gujarat, which is a very diverse place, in some places there's been a lot less of this kind of activity. And I think it's, again, because people realize that this is not going to fly, that it's not going to have local support and in a way that it might in other places. And so my sense is that people do policy, these folks, that Paul Brass has kind of talks about institutional riot systems that happen in various parts of India. I think this is kind of a combination of organizations as well as, political incentives oftentimes, but also economic ones, that kind of come together and have these effects and I think we're living in a political moment where there are gains to be had from this type of ethnic mobilization more than there were at different times in India's history. And so whether that's sort of more of a kind of a zeitgeist thing or, it's kind of some person being really clever, I can't say for sure. I mean, but I think that, it's going to resonate, more in certain places than others. And we know from history and from various research that which ones those are likely to be. I think that's the, so for example, again, Benares, there's a lot of discussion about if you see the land, the skyline of Benares, and, there are mosques that have been built over temples. And I think, Diana Eck and other people who would know about these things have documented these things. And so, but it's often been a very peaceful place, even though there's strong religious identities. And again, I think, there is this, not only the social kind of fabric in Benares that's existed for thousands of years, but there's also this complementarity as well. And so, whether that continues over time is a question, and I don't know the answer. I think people have to kind of oftentimes when people are doing this, they balance these kind of questions and think, well, is this message going to resonate more or less at this specific time? Does it make sense to me to do it right now or not? And so, I think, for example, Prime Minister Modi, it's interesting how, after the Gujarat elections in 2002, where in the next round of elections, he had a very pro-business, very, not sectarian platform at all. It was very much about development and vikas rather than about ethnic mobilization. And that actually attracted a lot of support from, places which had these traditions of tolerance. And so, I think that people adapt to the circumstances and the messages change at different times depending on what the incentives are, but also what the situation is.
You've brought us to a nice point about political competition. So the way I understand that literature, and this is, some of the work done by Wilkinson, if there is a very, very high or close electoral competition between different parties, and it is in fact the minority groups that will swing one way or another or help build a coalition, then that will reduce the likelihood of, or at least change the incentives of the political leaders to play the ethnic card and instead find, ways to build the coalition. On the other hand, if there is a lot of competition, but you don't have the minority as the group that can create the coalition, you are more likely to, of course, sort of instigate ethnic riots and benefit from that electorally. And the third part of that is if it's not a close contest at all, then you can go either way, right? You can either have incredible incentives to instigate violence because of this kind of majoritarian, benefit or protection. It immunizes any political group against backlash, or you're already so big and you're winning so comfortably that, there's really no point. You could move on to other things. How would you characterize Modi's win post the Gujarat riots? Like, which category is he falling in? Is he winning so comfortably that now he just doesn't need to rely on that kind of instigating violence between ethnic groups? Or is the competition getting bigger, or are Muslim groups more likely to contribute to him politically? Like, what's going on in that electoral contest?
N is equal to 1. So it's hard to kind of extrapolate. And, I don't know personally what he was thinking, obviously. But it is interesting, at least when I studied this, it did seem to be the case that if you look at the marginal constituencies in the 2002 election, there were these places where they had this history of Hindus and Muslims competing with one another. And those swung towards the BJP in the elections immediately after the riots. And so, but they swung against them in the medieval port towns. And in fact, if you look at the next elections, the medieval port towns become the marginal constituencies. They're the ones that are kind of that you might want to win if with a change in platform. And so of course, this is a small incentive, but if you care about, winning seats, then, it makes sense to, the Ahmedabads in, many of those economically competitive constituencies in Ahmedabad are now sort of stronger BJP places. You want to go after the marginal constituencies, and those were medieval ports where people respond more to kind of a pro-business, more development platform. And it is interesting that that is the platform that he then adopted. I mean, he could have done it for other reasons as well. And maybe that's what he believed. And so, but, I think that there are these incentives that change when you have marginal constituencies that resonate with certain messages, which I think can lead to contagion in state politics. The state government, state politicians will focus more on those, and so they're when they're the ones which are kind of shaping who wins more or fewer seats, they're the ones that the platforms are going to more likely to adopt. Now, I think that you can then have this contagion of kind of places which have which are more tolerant of a kind of an ethnic violence platform, shall we say, reflected in state government platforms, as well as their willingness to kind of counter these types of activities. Or you can also have contagion on the other side of tolerance when you have kind of places which are more pro-business, shall we say, or pro-peace, being the marginal constituencies, and then the state government focuses more on those, and they might be more willing to kind of stop these types of activities from occurring as well. So this is kind of something I've been interested in, and I haven't, but again, it's like you need a bigger study than, just like studying Gujarat in 2002 versus the next election, 2007.
How does, say, a marriage endogamy play into this, right? So my hunch is that an increase in exogamous marriage practices should increase peace in the long run, because you have these sort of marriage ties or kinship ties between different communities or different ethnic groups, and that should build peace. But on the other hand, we know that, endogamy is the most persistent feature of South Asian life, right? Like, I mean, it's pretty irrespective of war or partition or colonial government or now modern day liberalized economy. I mean, the number of exogamous marriages are about the same no matter what, right? And now we can see that there is this idea of love jihad, right? Which is not economic competition, but this kind of social competition from men of a different group in the potential marriage market, not in the economic market. How do you think this is playing? Because I feel like this kind of cultural social competition is being used in a really big way as a major threat to stoke intergroup violence, right? I mean, the number of Hindus marrying Muslims is minuscule, and yet it seems to weigh so heavily, when these discussions are taking place. They're almost in every major hate speech that's being given, or, things like that. So is this again the same idea of competition and complementarity, which is going to start coming under threat as we move towards a more plural life, more liberal, modern life, where there is less sort of strict endogamous marriage?
No, these are great questions. I think that, it reminds me a lot of, frankly, the old South. I mean, this was sort of a big thing that, that folks in the South used to raise as part of a kind of a platform of exciting ethnic tension. I think there's something visceral about it. It sort of kind of ties with kind of social norms and ideas of, what is misogyny being, tolerated or invoking disgust. And so I think it's definitely got an instrumental element to it, I think. And so then you have to ask, what are the incentives to kind of raise these issues, given, as you said, that they're not, it doesn't happen often, at all, as far as I understand it.
At least certainly not in the numbers that it should be this huge threat to Hinduism, I mean, that's kind of how it's portrayed, right? So that's what I meant.
As I understand it, like whole of South Asia is going through a demographic transition. And so, everyone's having fewer kids as the country gets richer. But there's always this kind of discussion on the table about, demographics, and which makes sense in a democracy. I mean, and when people vote along religious or ethnic lines. And so I suspect it has more to do with sort of the political leverage, because it does seem to resonate with what happened in the South. Yeah. But it's not something I've studied carefully, to be honest.
Just to switch gears for a little bit, I want to move on from looking at the impact of trade on ethnic conflict to looking at the impact of war, which is sort of the other extreme. And this is some of your work with Wilkinson, and you're basically trying to understand what happens to ethnic conflict if the population has more military experience, right? And you do this by looking at whether they were exposed to World War II for longer periods through their randomly assigned army battalions or for shorter periods, and what's the impact of that. And what I find interesting about that paper is it's actually a really large effect, which shocked me, right? So, I mean, you find that if there's increase in combat experience during World War II, there's a pretty large reduction in religious minorities in those areas, in those districts. So there's basically some kind of out migration, right? And this kind of additional military experience seems to have facilitated both the ethnic cleansing that might have happened, in a immediate riot or during partition and so on, and also encouraging in-group migration, right? Because those people are more likely looking for protection. And I guess, more in-group people who are, who used to be soldiers and can offer protection is probably. So everything in that paper made sense the moment I read it. What just shocked me was just the outsize effect, right? So can you walk me through what is going on in these areas? And it feels like just a few more months of World War II can't possibly be having these huge kinds of effects, right? So what is happening historically in these districts, or, what are the historical relationships between these groups, and what is causing this kind of, sort of massive sort of segregation? I mean, the long run effect of this is, of course, segregation and ghettoization.
I mean, so Stephen and I are actually writing a book about this, and it's sort of become we were really struck by, the kind of the accounts of the partition and how different they were from kind of what we'd read growing up. It's like people in the farm, neighbors going after neighbors, and things falling apart. But some of the work by Indivar Kamtekar and others looking at this period have kind of pointed out the role of military organization, kind of making things really go to the next level, shall we say? So we've been very interested in sort of how military combat experience can then kind of create this organizational possibility, which sometimes can lead to democracy and freedoms, but other times can lead to ethnic violence. And so we're trying to understand when and why that happens. And so, you think about January 6th in the United States, where, one reason why it got extra scary, I think, for democracy was that there were a number of folks who were military veterans who helped organize the infiltration of the Capitol and the insurrection. And so, this kind of private organizational capacity can be very powerful. And so we've been looking at how French soldiers who served in the American Revolution came back and played an important disproportionate role in the French Revolution. It wasn't just Lafayette. It was like a whole bunch of folks who kind of brought both skills and ideas about them back with them. You see this in Russia with the Decembrists as well. In South Asia, India, I think people often talk about the Indian army in World War II as being the forgotten army, because a lot of the accounts don't really focus on the fact that it was the largest volunteer army in world history, at 3% of the population of South Asia, male population, which is not
non-trivial,
small. No. And so, and these guys, they served in Italy, they served in Burma, they served in Africa. It was a kind of a crucial part of the Allied war effort. And so, one thing that we were interested in is that, because of this kind of martial races theory, the British had, in some, largely to do with 1857 and the uprising there, they decided that certain groups were more or less martial. Ironically, the ones that revolted against them in 1857 were seen as less martial. But, if you're a vegetarian, they didn't think you were a good soldier. If you had, various things. But they had detailed caste handbooks. So we followed each district and tried to see whether they thought that the castes in those districts were seen as martial or not. And even though that's kind of, I don't think that's random, but it was predetermined from the perspective of World War II. And once they're in the army, they mixed the they'd have these mixed assignments. So you might be recruited from a particular caste in a particular village into the companies, but then you'd kind of create these mixed battalions and they'd send them wherever they needed them. And so many of them were about to fight the Germans in Africa, and instead Japan enters the war, and they get sent to Burma instead. And so we use this variation to get a kind of a sense of their combat exposure. And it turns out that the ones that the districts which had where the minority got the combat experience, they end up having relatively peaceful flows of largely. It seems like they're able to organize and move. Where the majority got it and the minority didn't have the combat experience, that was the worst situation. So
that's the ethnic cleansing, basically.
Yeah. So the majority, basically you have an organized majority that can sort of engage in and knows how to organize violence. And you have a minority that's not able to move in anticipation of it. And so that's when, you get this situation. I think we found the situation, the cleansing was the worst. But there were situations where the minority got it and they were big enough that they, could see the writing on the wall. and so, for example, in Lialpur, the Sikh community was pretty large. It was, and they happened to receive a lot of combat experience in the Second World War, soldiers from that community. Before the line was decided, it was actually a very peaceful place. They'd organized defensive jatas around the area, and no one wanted to mess with those guys. And so that district stayed very peaceful in the run up to partition. But then they realized that they're far within far within the borders of Pakistan, that they weren't going to be given to India. So then they mobilized like the whole community. I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of people, and the soldiers played a larger role in that. The veterans of World War II kind of figuring out they're moving 20 miles a day with their worldly possessions. It's, I can barely walk 20 miles a day without running but they're doing it like, they're choosing where to have the water. They're choosing defensible spots. And this is something you learn in the military much more. So, when you're trying to mobilize large numbers of people, than, you do as it's like camping in the mountains, right? So they were able to mobilize and move folks, and they not only moved them, they actually chose where to move them. So they kind of, a lot of these guys were channeled into parts of Punjab, which then, for the first time in history, had Sikh majorities. And so this changed, of course, the political situation in the Punjab as well, on the Indian side, even while, but it's kind of these two things that you can do to control local ethnic demography. One is get rid of the minorities, and the other one is to bring in people like you. And one of them is more peaceful than the other. One of them is like you're accepting refugees, but it's still a public good. And we find that both of those channels were at play, suggesting that there's this organizational benefit to those groups of this combat experience. And we kind of, then we began to see this everywhere. That's why we're kind of writing a book about it, that the wars aren't over when they're, when they're over. In fact, external wars can often lead to large scale political change at home when the veterans return. And, depending on how societies manage that, they can, these veterans can be, big forces for peace and democracy, but they can also be forces for revolution and ethnic conflict too, depending on, if only certain groups get the experience versus it's broadly spread around.
The other interesting thing about this is, in India, traditionally, a lot of the battalions, again, since the British handbooks on caste, have been designed around caste and ethnic groups, right? So that's one part of it. But today, unlike during World War II, the people who serve and have military experience are just a really tiny fraction of the population, right? So now, what does this mean for India today? Does it mean that you're neither going to get the crazy kind of violence, nor are you going to get the crazy organizational capability because they're just such a small part of the community that it shouldn't matter? Or does combat experience even today, especially in areas of insurgency and in border areas, mean something for other districts in India which have nothing to do with this kind of insurgency?
One thing that I found, I found many things interesting from Stephen's work, but he has a book on Army and Nation where, he actually looks at, the caste composition of the Indian Army even today is actually fairly similar to what it was like when the British martial races were in place. And so, armies tend to be quite conservative. They're like, well, this has worked for us. Why should we change it? And so, so there are these imbalances. They've been changing over time, but there were kind of moments, especially like in the 80s, when there was sort of a potential risk that certain army battalions were going to march on Delhi. So, after in 84 in particular, right? So I think more generally, like you said, the regional level, it can make a difference. So, there are sort of like the Assam Rifles, some of those veterans, if they're not, I think part of the story is we need to make sure that they're, we channel some of their organizational capacity in positive directions and give them a stake in development, because, they have a lot of skills to offer. And just like the Japanese samurai did, you want to make sure that they're integrated rather than, facing kind of ethnic grievances, which can hold back development. And so I think, you're right. As a share of the national population, it's not a large number in India. It's larger elsewhere, obviously. I think part of the issue is in Afghanistan, there are whole generations of people who've only, who've experienced war. And that's what they know how to do. They're very good at it oftentimes. And so what do you do when you have groups who have these skills? In Iraq, it definitely, the disbanding of the Sunni majority army by the U.S. Without giving them a kind of options on what to do. I think many of them joined the insurgencies because they could see that in a Shia majority democracy, their situations might not be great for them. And so I think this is sort of so. I think locally, the Indian Army is sort of. One success of the Indian system, I think, is that the army is not seen as a major threat to the democracy of the country, but in other places it has been, and so I think we shouldn't take our Jawans for granted. Yeah, we should really think about how to channel their abilities in positive ways, and I think the GI Bill, for example, that the U.S. instituted after World War II, and the bonus bill, these are really good ideas of and these may be things that we should think about in India also.
I want to go back again to like a pre-partition moment. And this is, again, about Indian exceptionalism, right? You talked about how India is exceptional when it comes to the army, and, India is exceptional in South Asia when it comes to this kind of, democratic success, or at least continuous democratic success, just by virtue of existence of elections peacefully, if not anything else. Is this work on Indian exceptionalism because of the non-violent mass movements? Once again, one should not expect to see this kind of movement, certainly not for the length of period that India saw, and nor the kind of coalition that formed around the non-violence movement. Both of those are exceptional. And, the way we've studied the Cliff Notes version of this is, of course, Gandhi was amazing, and he was inspirational, and he created this massive movement and this coalition, which may all be true, but it doesn't tell us very much about the incentives. And what I like about your work with Rikhil Bhavnani is that you're now digging into the incentives of, who are the people who are joining this movement and what's going on there. So one is, of course, the trade shocks that come because of the depression, right? So all the people who are reliant more on the British mercantilist trade system are now not getting as much of a benefit from the colonial government because of this massive global trade shock. And so they are now poorer, which means they're much better off allying with a different group, which in this instance is the Indian National Congress, and sort of the umbrella movement, which is promising them more protectionism, other kinds of reforms, universal adult franchise, land reforms, so on. So that's, one part of the story. And the other part of the story, which is quite interesting, is that it is not something that starts as an elite movement, right? This very quickly becomes, in most other places when we're thinking about these kinds of ideas, they just remain elite movements. And here it very quickly becomes one, elite and non-elite coalition, and two, an urban and rural coalitions. All the different kinds of coalitions break down, even if everyone is not equally impacted by the trade shocks, right? Is this a good characterization?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating, it's sort of, as scholars of social movements and kind of mobilization along ethnic lines, it's really striking to think about how inclusive the Indian struggle for independence struggle was. I mean, it did encompass like a large swath of Indian society, and it stayed relatively peaceful as well, which is the other kind of surprising thing, especially when you think about kind of all the things we were discussing about ethnic conflict and mobilizing and these things. So I also think you're right that one thing I was struggling with is sort of the takeaway message that we often get from when we read about the Indian independence struggle is, well, first get yourself a Gandhi, get a charismatic leader, and then take it from there. I mean, as a kind of an economist, I find that it might be true, but it's also something that I wish there was something a bit more generalizable that we could do. And it turns out that I think. Of course, Gandhi played an important role, but he got a lot of things wrong. And in fact, I think the more we studied it, the more we realized that of his three mass movements, the satyagrahas, only one was really successful. The one in the 30s, the civil disobedience movement. The 20s, it led to the first kind of wave of Hindu-Muslim violence, like mass violence. The 40s was, the Congress ended up in jail and they decapitated the leadership overnight. And so it's only in the 30s where they really kind of were able to leverage, I think, this cadre of people committed to nonviolent acts of civil disobedience, this leadership cohort, as well as, the incentives which had people, supporting them in a way that, at a mass level. And we think the depression had a large part of this. I mean, one thing that I noticed, which kind of spoke to me, was that for one, there are, as you know, in India, gold is kind of a big deal, and it's a big store of family wealth, and it plays an important social and cultural role in marriage. And historically, I mean, you look at Pliny the Elder in ancient Rome, you look at the East India Company, Josiah Child, they're all talking about how India is like the sink of world gold. I mean, it's one thing that India has always done has been kind of a stink of gold, and people are willing to sell all kinds of stuff to have gold. But there's sort of two moments in history where this is reversed, where India is actually exporting gold, and one of them was kind of more recently when gold prices went really, really high. But the other one is during the Great Depression, and so I think oftentimes people think, well, the Great Depression didn't hit India very hard, but the fact that India is exporting gold, that people are really that suggests that this is a very, very difficult time. And so when, I think the Congress, what they did, which was very clever in the 30s, was then say, before they were kind of agitating on this sort of platform of, we should get rid of the sedition acts and, have a few nationalist newspaper freedom, more freedom of that kind. But, I don't know how much that resonated with a lot of people. But then they said, well, our platform is going to be about regressive taxation. We're going to go campaign about salt. I mean, this is something we all see. It's unjust. And the British have a monopoly over it, that they are taxing everybody in this unjust way. And we're going to make it about that. And so that's something that, everyone has a stake in. I mean, no matter what your religion is or your caste. I mean, it was a very inclusive platform. So the Salt March brings attention to that in an important way. And I think Gandhi is very clever in bringing media attention to this issue, because if you just picked up some sand off the coast and said, I'm breaking the salt laws, I don't think it would have been that dramatic than if you kind of walk, wait for the New York Times to be there when you actually do it. And that has more of an impact. And so, even though the movement was highly censored, they were able to leverage that and get people involved. And I think that was very clever. But I think also one thing we also notice is that by kind of selecting these guys, like you had said, if you look at the Congress leadership in the 1919 period, it is the elites. It's like more than half of them are lawyers. But, through his reforms in this moment between 1919 and 1922, they changed it so that, it's much more non-elite folks who are entering, and really a credential is going to jail for non-violent acts of civil disobedience. And so, you have to give up all kind of business before the British government. So if you're a lawyer, you can't practice law. And so this is kind of selecting people who no longer have this outside option, in the existing system, and who are really committed to non-violence as well as to independence, in getting independence peacefully. And we think that this is part of the secret sauce, if you will, that this, they were able to develop an organization of folks who are selected with these characteristics. And so, and so much so that Gandhi himself sees this to be as relevant later on, because all these guys develop their own identities as leaders, so that, later on his influence is much more marginal than it is initially. So it's really, he's kind of engineered his own replacements in some ways.
Yeah. And, it's interesting. You talked about how one of the things that is, the signal is that you need to give up everything and go to jail. Right. And here, I think the secret sauce in building the elite plus non-elite coalition, right? Because it's a very costly signal for the elites relative to the non-elites. I mean, they're giving up more in terms of opportunities. And it's almost like, some of that literature which is talking about the economics of religion literature, where you're talking about, this massive personal sacrifice as the signal to the in-group to prevent free riding. And you can very easily free ride a mass movement and then commit violence whenever, when it's convenient. But now you need to make a very, very costly sort of sacrifice, very public, very costly sacrifice, which includes going to jail, to signal the same thing. And here, the thing was, one of the mechanisms in your paper on what is driving people coming from rural India and, all sorts of different groups as opposed to the erstwhile elites in the Congress is this economic shock, right? So my sense was it may have started out with the economic shock, like that's the impetus to participate. But eventually it seems like the non-elites, the cost of this public sacrifice is much lower. It's, in a sense, less costly for someone, who's a landless farmer to say, I'm going to go to jail, relative to someone who's a lawyer with a big practice or something like that. And to me, it seems like that's the reason why it might have forged this big connection, because now non-elites can participate even if they don't have funding or connections or anything else, as long as they can make this big personal sacrifice, which on the margin is less costly than for the elites.
I think you're right that, there are a lot of things that were done to make it very costly for the elites, relatively speaking. And so, even like the daily, like there was a rule that as a Congress volunteer, you have to spend an hour a day doing the charkha, like spinning and so time is costly for everybody. And so people really complained about it, like, what are we wasting our time doing? But it really selects folks who are really committed to this, and particularly folks who value their time a lot, right? So I think that was also kind of it's not only an identity thing, building kind of a common identity, but it also had the screening aspect as well. But it's also the case that, these guys had to, got beaten up. There are a lot of really difficult things they went through. And so, I think that the sacrifices were hard for everybody. I think another interesting thing that they did is they didn't try to make it a big movement. The volunteers were actually relatively small in number, but they're highly screened. And so that they were, like you said, there were many who didn't come from necessarily elite backgrounds as well. So it was cross-cutting in that sense. But the elites that did participate were then kind of even more kind of unusual, like Rajendra Prasad and these other guys who ceased to, be rich because they devoted their lies to the mission.
Yeah, but here it feels also like India might be doomed in one sense, right? Because for long run economic growth, you need peace, and you need these kind of peaceful mass movements that can foster democracy and civil association and so on. And yet it feels like the bedrock on which India's peaceful civil association is built is on protectionism and autarkic trade, and not on this kind of, global social cooperation. So where does that leave Indians from a cultural perspective?
I mean, I think that you're right that the Congress's platform was a protectionist platform, and they were pretty clear about it. But
it's also the thing that benefits them the most, right? In a sense, it's the protectionists who are willing to fund them, and it's the people who've experienced the negative trade shock who are willing to join them. So aside from it just being, one of their platforms, it's also politically the only way to maneuver this movement in one sense at that point in time.
Yeah, but I agree that at that time, this is, but they I mean, I think the key, there are two things that they did. I mean, that was important. One is that they campaigned on an economic justice platform, which doesn't have to be protectionist, but as it was the case that they had these industrialist backers, that was part of their platform. But the economic justice platform, I think, is the key, right? So, the salt tax, the land reform, and land reform wasn't perfect in India, but it did happen after independence, and it happened much more so than in Pakistan, where where even today they have these large estates, and Pakistani politics is very different.
It's very feudal, yeah.
Yeah, and so so one thing that we are particularly interested in was the fact that the fact that India had a nonviolent mass movement meant that the leaders, made good Democrats at some level. They depended on, consent of large groups of people for their, for their authority. And that's what makes you a good Democrat. If you're kind of dependent on military ideas, then, or just to take an example, if you think that intelligence, you're an intelligence agent and you use intelligence approaches when you become president. But these guys were leaders of large groups, and so, the fact that they kind of promised land reform, democracy made land reform credible because, the median voter is going to be relatively poor, and that they kind of were basically had been trained to depend on consent, and that's something they were good at, I think really had a very beneficial effect for Indian democracy after independence in a way that, the coalition in Pakistan didn't have that same characteristic. It was not, they hadn't given up on violence as part of their platform. They hadn't, they didn't promise land reform. It was kind of a religious based platform rather than an inclusive economic justice platform. And so even though, I don't think it needed to be a protectionist platform, but the fact that economic justice was kind of emphasized and was seen as a way of bringing people together across different religious and caste and ethnic groups, I think it's something that still is a way forward for the country. I mean, it's like a.
But I've learned from you by reading all your work on how important norm setting is, right? So once you set this norm of, this kind of Swadeshi goods, and I mean, we still have a make in India, sort of trying to reverse the liberalization, tariff reduction, and so on. We're still going about that in modern day India. So, the two, I agree with you that, they started out on that platform and that need not persist. But I've also learned from you that these norms typically tend to persist for a really long time, given the right conditions and the right incentives. And it seems like the incentives are perfect for protectionism at any given point in time. And once you have this kind of norm setting, it can take a whole other life. So that's why I ask if you're doomed.
I'm always optimistic about it. I mean, I think it's India is a country that has been able to it's an environment that's been so diverse. People have lived together peacefully, and they've been able to do so, despite a lot of difficulties. And I think, things hopefully, will. I think that the ability to reinvent and to kind of come up with new ways and new ideas, jugaad, solve the problems, I think is something that's very widespread and kind of gives us hope, or should give us all hope.
Thank you so much for doing this, Saumitra. This was such a pleasure.
No, thank you, Shruti.
Ideas of India is produced by the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. If you enjoy this podcast, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. Help us grow by giving us a rating and leaving a review. Follow us on Twitter at @SRajagopalan and @Ideas of India. Also check out our initiative commemorating 30 years of India's market reforms at the 1991project.com.